Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our office hours this week. Uh, we are going to get started. Today, we are talking about transition from CDS to public school. And this is our supervision, monitoring, and support team office hours. But today we have Lori Whittemore here to talk about this process. And before I turn it over to her, we're just going to give our introductions of our team real quick. As a reminder, this is our contact information so that you can reach out to us if your questions come up or if you'd like feedback around anything. My name is Carly Thibodeau, and with me today, I have Julie Pelletier.
Hi, I'm Julie Pelletier. I am the admin support for the monitoring team. I have been with the DOE now for, I'm actually in my 8th year. And prior to that, I was admin support at a K-5 elementary school for 16 years.
Awesome, thank you. And then this is the rest of our team. And like I said, you can reach out to us at any time. This is the best way to get in contact with us through our email. And as I said, we're going to talk about that transition from CDS to public school. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lori Whittemore.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Carly said, we're going to be talking about the transition from CDS to public school. This is my 3rd year of providing this presentation for the monitoring team, and I did add some new slides that will be a little bit later in the presentation, but I'm sure many of you are aware that there is a new law now that has moved the responsibility for FAPE for 3 to 5-year-olds to public school effective 2028. So there are implications on the transition related to that. So a little bit later in the presentation, we will be discussing that as well. But a little bit about my background. I have been working for over 35 years with young children and their families. I'll actually have my 30th anniversary with CDS in September, which is pretty exciting. During that time, I was a site director for 22 years and have participated in many, many, many transition meetings. I also have a son with autism, so I think that gives me a really unique, important perspective that I bring to interacting with families and understanding how scary it can be to face a big transition for your child with a disability. So a few things to think about in terms of successful transitions for children and families. It really is important that the professionals are really on the same page. So it is vital that all the professionals view parents as their children's primary teachers and the most important members of the transition process. All of the legal requirements are outlined in MUSER related to the transition process, and we'll be reviewing those today. And really the successful transition occurs when everyone's really prepared, when the current team has shared the child's present levels, goals, and accommodations, and the SAU's reviewed all that information and is prepared to make an offer of FAPE. So especially for those children who have an option to stay in CDS for another year, which we'll talk more about, it's really important that the parents understand what the preschool IEP would look like, and then what a public school IEP would look like, so that they can really have important input into that decision. The next question is around who is eligible for a transition meeting, and that is that a child who lives within the SAU and turns 5 on or before the 15th on the first day of school would be eligible to start school as a kindergarten child. And then, of course, there has to be an exception, because there always is, right? So as I mentioned earlier, that 676 provides that, Chapter 676 provides that exception. And so there are 2 components to that. The first is the birthday of the child. So if a child is born between July 1st and October 15th, that would be the birth window where we would consider that option of staying in preschool for an additional year. And so the child has to have an IEP on December 1st of the previous year to be considered for that. And there is a little bit of an exception to that. Sometimes there are pretty significant delays within CDS based on provider shortages. So if, for example, let's just say a child was referred in September of the year before they went to kindergarten, and the CDS team did not get an IEP in place for December 1st, they would be out of compliance, because if the child if the parent had signed consent in September, they would have 60 days to get that IEP in place. If there is a non-compliance on the results of CDS, there may be an exception to that. The state director would review all of the data around that. If the parent really wanted the child to stay and the team felt like that was in the best interest of the child, there may be an opportunity, if there was non-compliance on the part of CDS in identifying the child in a timely manner. So the other piece of that is the team. There has to be an IEP team meeting, and that needs to be the parent, both CDS and the public school. So it's not just the parent saying, I don't want my child to go to kindergarten. There really has to be a formal IEP meeting where the team determines that it best meets the individual needs of the child to remain in the CDS system and not enter kindergarten. So that language is pretty ambiguous, right? Best meets the individual needs, and how do you define that? It's not, the standard isn't equivalent to the free appropriate public education, and the Individualized Education Program team may determine that remaining in CDS may best meet the individual needs of the child, even if the kindergarten program that's available to the child could provide FAPE. And that's why it's just important to really, for the public school to have a firm offer. Sometimes I've been to meetings where, the parents have said, I really don't feel like my child is ready. I want them to stay in CDS another year. And the public school agrees, but they haven't made an offer of FAPE. They haven't said like, well, let's just review what kindergarten could look like for your child so that we really can make an informed decision together. So that's important that happen. In the event that the parent disagrees with the decision of the individual education program team and decides to use dispute resolution procedures, the standard for review must be whether the individual education program team decision best meets the individual needs of the child. So the parents really have a lot of weight in this decision. That's been my experience, is, the team really listens to really what the family's goals are for their child. And it would be rare, I think, that the team would go against what the parent wanted in most situations. So I think that's important to consider. So best practice considerations for Chapter 676 eligible children. As we talked about, it's important, as with all team meetings, to consider the goals and desires of the parent. And then the child's current provider should review the child's current goals, present levels, progress updates, and accommodations. The SAU should review what kindergarten will look like, and then the IEP team would make that decision based on the individual needs of the child. When does the transition meeting need to occur? So there is a time frame outlined in user that states the transition meeting would occur sometime between April 1st and June 15th. And then best practice considerations prior to the meeting. Historically, before districts had access to our data system, which we call SYNC, paper records were sent in December of every year for children who were eligible for transition. Now that districts have access to SYNC, the district can access everything about that child. So the IEP, the written notice, all the evaluations, the communication log where the case manager has recorded all their conversations or information they've gotten in the mail, when they've communicated with families, all of that is available now in SYNC. The case manager should still provide a list of children who are eligible for K, and if the district needs any additional information, they can request that as well, and that should be provided to the district just to make sure that they have everything that they need. Best practice would be that for children who have significant needs, let's just say they're in a specialized program, specialized preschool program, it would be important for the district staff to go and observe that child so that they could, think about what kind of placement would be most appropriate in kindergarten. And then what I used to do, I was the director at CDS Reach in Portland. We would have meetings with districts and we would just talk about children. We would just meet with the district staff and we would have the records and we would just go through, especially the children with more significant needs, and just talk about those children and answer questions. So if that's possible, I think that is helpful for the district to learn more about each child. Who is required to attend the transition meeting? So prior to the CDS site sending the advance written notice, the site and the SAU will jointly, with the input from the parent, determine who will be the members of the team. Typically, it is the child's current team. So if they are in a program, it would be their teacher, any related service providers that they're seeing. Both the CDS site and the SAU has to have a representative who is qualified and authorized to obligate funding. So CDS would have an IEP administrator, and then there would be an administrator from the district as well. Of course, there needs to be a regular ed teacher present from the district, and then any other members that they feel would be important to represent their district in terms of what the individual needs of that child was. And then who is responsible for which components of the process? So the CDS site is responsible to convene the joint IEP team meeting in the spring of the year prior to the child's right to enroll in public school. Typically, what we did at Reach is to work with each district and come up with a schedule. The district would give us dates when they were going to have their staff available for those meetings. And then we would talk about how long for each IEP meeting, depending on how complex the child was. For like simple speech children was usually just 30 minutes, but certainly longer if a child had more significant needs. The receiving SAU is responsible for the facilitation of the IEP team meeting, the development of any IEP amendments, and then the written notice for this joint meeting. And then best practice considerations. The SAU is responsible for facilitating the meeting, amending the IEP, and if necessary, for creating the written notice. The amended IEP will clearly differentiate the responsible parties and the service timeframes for which each party is responsible. So typically, if there is an amendment where the services could look different, once the child enters kindergarten, the dates would reflect that first day of school when those new services would take effect. There would also maybe be some specific transition goals that would be a joint responsibility, such as a visit to the classroom or a ride on a public school bus. And then the educational program developed for the child by the SAU with the input from CDS to be implemented on the first day of public school will be recorded as an amendment to the IEP. In effect, at the time of the transition meeting in the spring of the year, the child will transition from CDS to public school. And then these documents should be shared with CDS upon completion. And if any requested team members are unable to attend the transition meeting, especially the child's current team members, they should send a written report with the child's progress updates, present levels of performance, and any recommendations the IEP team should consider. Does anyone have any questions so far?
There is actually a question in the chat,
okay.
and I'm not sure if we'll have this answer, but
Okay.
it's a question about an SAU is participating in cohort 2 that will be coming up. And so they're wondering, what did cohort 1 SAUs do about transition meetings for 3 and 4-year-olds?
Okay, we actually are going to talk about that today. So if we can just hold that for a minute, because we're going to get to those slides pretty quickly. Awesome. About the cohorts, and I can definitely answer that.
Excellent. Okay, that's the only question in chat so far.
Okay. Nobody has any other questions? We can continue. So who is responsible for the annual review of the IEP? It's expected that in user, it says that an annual review of the IEP due to take place during the time period of the transition meeting or even the summer when public school staff are not working, that would occur prior to the transition meeting. So CDS tries really hard to have those meetings that are taking place sometime in the spring and summer before the transition meeting. There are times when districts find that it's helpful to actually have a joint or a concurrent meeting. The regulations are clear that this can happen if the public school wants it to. Some districts really don't. They find like it's just too much for a family to do an annual and then do the transition meeting. But it may work fine, especially for like a speech child. And then you have all that information that's very fresh. And so if the public school wanted to hold some of the annuals at the same time or just before on the same day as the transition meeting, that can happen. There does need to be two separate advanced written notices. One would say an annual review at 10 o'clock, and then at 10:30 or 11 they would complete the transition meeting. Okay, and what if the IEP team determines that additional evaluation data is needed? So if the transition team determines there's not sufficient information to address all the child's needs that result from the child's disability, the transition IEP team can determine that additional evaluations will be conducted. If CDS needs an evaluation to complete its responsibilities, CDS is responsible for the cost of that evaluation. So if we need something to amend the IEP, if something new has come up and we feel like we need more evaluative data to make sure the child is accessing FAPE, CDS would fund any evaluations. Otherwise, the evaluations will be paid for by the receiving SAU, which may use the federal IDEA Part B section 619 funds. Evaluations for which parental consent is received by the SAU before the start of the school year will be governed by the 60-day calendar requirement for completing the evaluation, which is for preschool children. So sometimes, just for an example, we've had children, I've been in meetings where a child is under developmental delay. They're making good progress toward their IEP goals. As we know, at this point, a child can only be under that category for the kindergarten year, and then the district would need to do additional assessment to look at other categories before they went to first grade. That is something that's being considered to extend that in the user rewrite. Erin Fraser's hoping that that age will be extended past kindergarten. But for now, it only is in effect until kindergarten is over. So let's just say child's making great progress. CDS doesn't need anything to implement the IEP until the child goes to kindergarten. The district says, I would like a psychoval to look at, are there other factors that may result in a different category? In that instance, that would be the responsibility of the SAU to fund that evaluation, since CDS doesn't need that to continue the IEP, since the child's making good progress with the current plan. And who's responsible for extended school year services prior to the child entering kindergarten? So that would be the CDS site. We remain responsible for extended school year services up until the beginning of the school year for the child that's going to be enrolled in kindergarten. Okay, now we're going to transition into the language and the implications of schools who are taking over the FAPE responsibility. So this is the public law. 2023, Chapter 643, Part W is the actual law. In April of last year, in 2024, the Maine legislature approved a bill that allowed school administrative units to provide early childhood special education services to preschool age children with disabilities, and that all school administrative units were to offer these services by July 1st, 2028. So this school year that we're in was cohort 1 that was effective in September, and they were responsible for the children at that point. And then cohort 2 would be this coming September when they would take over that responsibility. So for children who were in cohort 1, there doesn't have to be a transition meeting, which is fabulous. There's no need for a transition meeting because they have been writing those IEPs. They've been having those annual reviews. They know these children. And so they will just continue on. And of course, if there's an annual review, you would hold out like you would for any child. But there does not need to be a transition meeting because they have already transitioned to your district. And SAUs assume the responsibility for FATE for 3 to 5 year olds. As I just said, there's no need for a transition meeting for kindergarten. However, the transition occurs at age 3 from Part C to Part B 619. So basically, we've changed the transition requirement. The nice thing about the Part C requirement is that it's not, 20, 100, however, depending on the size of your district, the number of children that has to be in that really finite window from April 1st to June 15th, is a lot to do all of that in a very short time frame. The Part C requirement is that an IEP has to be in place on the child's 3rd birthday. So that's rolling right throughout the year. And so it's just more gradual. When children turn 3, you need to be part of that process of being part of the transition conference, which I'm not going to go into a lot of details about that today, but there are specific requirements for when a transition conference has to happen before the child turns 3. And schools would be invited to those. They would make decisions about what additional evaluations would be required. A lot of times, if a child has a 5-domain evaluation, which they all do in Part C, and it's fairly new, you can use that evaluation if they're going to continue under a developmental delay and they meet the criteria. So you'd be able to use that and then just have an IEP in place when they were 3 years old. And then you would be looking at what services were required. And I can answer, I'm not, like I said, I don't want to get in the weeds with this, but if people have specific questions, I can answer them as we go move forward, or I could have a meeting separately as well, if there was just one person who was interested in more information about that. One of the things that's been stressed to the CDS directors at our leadership meetings is that if a district is joining the cohort 2, and it was the same with cohort 1, that they start being invited to all of the IEP meetings for the annual reviews or for the initial eligibility meetings. They're at the table for those meetings so that they start to get to know their children now, so that when the transition happens in September, they'll be prepared. So my role in supporting the SAUs, as I said, I was a site director for 22 years. Since 2021, I've moved into a new role at the department. My title is Director of Preschool Program Development. I started off by opening a lot of preschool programs for CDS, and I actually have one of my classrooms here for you to see that I designed and set up. But this is my 2nd year of really focusing on public schools in the cohort. And so what I do now is I travel all over the state. A couple weeks ago, I was in Jonesport, and then I went to Island Falls, and next week I'm going to Freiburg and Auburn. So I just travel around. I meet with leadership, the special ed director, sometimes the superintendent, the principals, and I do an assessment of classrooms, and I look at the types of furniture and materials they have. I want to make sure that they have materials for younger children. So if there are districts who include 3-year-olds in their 4-year-old program, which is perfectly permissible to do, and it's being done successfully in cohort 1. But even if you didn't do that, you may have 4-year-olds who are functioning more like 2.5-year-olds because of their disability. So I want to make sure there are toddler type toys. I want to make sure there's furniture to support them, newer furniture. Some districts have furniture that's pretty dated, and so we've replaced furniture. I want to make sure there's lots of sensory and visuals, different accommodations that would need to be implemented for children to be successful in that environment. So I basically do an assessment. I provide a spreadsheet that I've worked super hard on that has about 450 items on it if I was going to be completely starting a new classroom, because sometimes districts are going to add a classroom, which is fabulous. And I've been able to furnish that and provide the materials for that with funding from the Aussie team. And I work with the leadership and teachers, especially, to make sure that they have the things that they need to create an optimal learning environment for all of the children in that setting. The children with disabilities and the typically developing children. So it's very exciting to take something that is empty and to help to support creating something that's optimal. The other thing I do is really empower teachers. So I provide the spreadsheet and there's a budget based on kind of what the classroom needs are. They can certainly take things off my spreadsheet and add things that they want to have for their classroom because it is their classroom. As long as they live within the budget, then that's perfectly fine to do as well. I also review IEPs with a special ed director to kind of look at what does it look like staffing would need to look like for these children. What are some different accommodations they might require, whether that's ed tech support or just more natural accommodations. What are some support staff that might be required to make sure they're successful in pre-K? So I'm available to do those types of roles with the SAUs. I did that. I set up 40 classrooms for cohort 1, and I'm available to support the cohort 2 classrooms as well. So I just want to share a brief story about my son. As I said, I have a son with autism, and I remember when he was in preschool and was diagnosed with autism, how terrified I was to think about sending him to kindergarten. He was in a really high quality preschool. They loved him. They understood him. He was getting his needs met. And I just was really scared that the public school would not honor his disability and support him, and he would fail, and just all those things that go through parents' minds. And transition to kindergarten is hard for all families. It's a big transition for a typical child, but when you have a child with a disability, I think it's just really magnified. So in my district, they had an open house for parents who had children with disabilities where you could come in and meet the special ed director and teachers and the related service providers, which I highly recommend. It was so helpful, and just to meet other families. And I remember saying to the special ed director after her presentation, I just don't feel like my son's going to be ready for kindergarten. I think I'm going to wait and hold him out a year. And she said, and I've this changed the trajectory of my career because I was in regular ed at that point. She said, Lori, it's not his job to be ready for kindergarten. It's our job to be ready for him, and we will be. And they were they had all of his accommodations, his support person. I remember the principal telling me stories of taking him swimming. He went with him to help him. It just was this beautiful school community that just rallied around him. And now he's a successful man who has a good job and is independent. And I'm just so proud of him. But that all happened because he had the supports he needed to thrive and to be his best self. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And in terms, I want to also share a story of a cohort 1 school up in Aroostook County. As many of you know, CDS has really struggled with finding enough services and enough programs for our children. When I was a director in Portland, there were many times, usually it would be around February or March, we would start to have children go on wait lists. And it was heartbreaking. I would do everything I could to find services, but there just were not enough. And that's magnified even more in the more rural areas of Maine. What I would do at that point is to kind of calculate those unmet needs and provide those services over the summer. And most of the time I was able to do that. Since COVID, when we lost many of our programs due to COVID, that has just magnified so much. And I know from talking with families and talking with districts who are receiving children, there definitely are children who have entered kindergarten that didn't get any services for their entire 2 years of preschool that they were entitled to, which is just heartbreaking. And families cannot get that time back. A child cannot get that time back. And certainly it wasn't because CDS didn't try, because they tried really hard, but there just were not providers to be found. So I do think there's a little bit of cultural thing that happens within CDS of just understanding that we just don't have enough people, and so kids have to wait. It's just part of the culture of CDS. Doesn't mean we don't try. It's just kind of a reality. And that and the more I've gotten to know and working with public schools within the cohorts, I've just seen, because my entire career has been in preschool, that that's just not the culture of public school. Like children have to get services when they go to public school. So there was a child in Aroostook County, or there was a partnership actually in a school in Aroostook County where they were going to partner with the community provider to serve 3-year-olds. And they were going to be serving the 4-year-olds. And it was all ironed out through an MOU. And at the last hour in August, the community partner lost their ed techs. They lost 2 ed techs that was going to be supporting 3-year-olds. And so they didn't have anyone to support those children. So they were not going to be able to come to school. And the special ed director was just like, they have to go to school. Like, what do you mean they can't come to school? They have to go to school. And so she created a program for them in the public school. She wasn't planning on 3-year-olds. She had like 2 or 3 weeks to scurry around and figure out how she was going to do that, but she did. And they started school on time. And guess what? They're thriving. They're doing amazing within public school. It's a combination 3- and 4-year-old program. They are making progress toward their IEP goals. They're part of the school community. As many special ed directors think, like 3-year-olds are super scary to them because they just haven't worked with that age group. And she's like, they're little sponges. They're used to the classroom routine. They're part of our group. The 4-year-olds serve as mentors and help them so that they can understand what to do and how to participate in the activities. And it's just going really, really well. So that's one of the things that I love about this transition is that children, I guess it's the thing that I love most, is that children will get the services that they need in a timely way. They won't be on wait lists. They'll be making progress toward their goals, and they'll be much more prepared for kindergarten when they're ready to move into that grade. This is my contact info. Feel free, certainly, as I said, if you have questions that maybe you wouldn't want to share in the big group. If you have questions, you can definitely email me and I can try to answer questions. If you have questions about the cohort, what that means for your district, I'm happy to meet with you on Zoom, meet with your school leadership at any point. All right. Did I answer the question about the cohort? Does anyone have any additional questions about that transition to the public school for the FAPE responsibility?
Hi, Lori. This is Nicole Heel. I just had a couple questions, if you don't mind.
No.
Okay, great. So right now, like the CDS kids on their IEP, we attach those goals to the MELDs. And then when they go into kindergarten, we have to switch it over to the standards. And so is that still going to be the same as school districts take on the students that when they transition from the preschool programs into the kindergarten, that IEP will be amended to switch that over?
Yes. At this point, yeah, you would still be using the MELDs for preschool. And then, yeah, I would just do it at the annual, right? So you can just say that effective on this date, these will be the goals.
Okay. So you could have your annual and transition in April, but I could say effective September when they go into
Exactly.
kindergarten.
These will be yes. Yep.
Okay.
Those more standards based. Yep.
Okay, great. And then, so let's say, so I am in a special purpose private school. So let's say I have a 3.5-year-old in my program and their home school district becomes part of the cohort, let's say cohort 2.
Yep.
And, but the child, 3.5-year-old, will stay with me in a special purpose private school. Would I be working with CDS or would I be working with the SAU?
The district. The SAU is responsible for all, if they're in cohort 2, they would be responsible for all children at age 3.
Okay. So
you would work with the district. Yep.
So that would include IEP purposes and financial purposes?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. They would be the ones to be, completing the annual review. All of those pieces are newly identifying a child, placing children with you. If that was something that they needed, to do for a particular child, they'd be making the referrals versus CDS.
They make the referrals. Okay.
Yep. So you'd be working with a special ed director from that district.
Okay, great. And so that would mean what we do with K through 12 is what we're going to be doing with preschoolers. So
Exactly.
user and all of that stuff is
All of
applying
that.
now.
Yes, absolutely. And so see how much nicer of a transition it will be
Oh,
for families.
hey.
You know what I mean? It's going to be
Yeah.
much smoother.
Yeah. I'm
When
on
they're
board for
ready
sure.
to move on to public school, then depending, no matter what their age, then that's when that will happen.
Okay. If there's a parent who lives in a district who their district is part of a cohort, early on cohort, does that parent have a choice of sending their child to the public preschool or another preschool of their choice? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah. So what I would say is what I said throughout the presentation, like the parent has, is a very vital, the most vital member of the IEP
Yeah.
team. And certainly the school needs to consider what the parent's wishes would be for that child. And if there's a way to honor that and it is going to result in a FAPE, then
Yep.
they should consider that. However, they do, and at the end of the day, they need to make an offer of FAPE. So, right. So they need to make an offer where they feel like FAPE can best be met. And whether that's in the public school program, a special purpose program, a community nursery school, whatever
Yeah.
that is, they need to make that offer. I mean, I certainly remember times when parents would want their child to stay in a program, just like a community program that really was not best. Like I had observed the child there, they were floundering. There was no curriculum. Like they weren't. It was a childcare, so they were safe, but they weren't going to be accessing faith. They weren't going to make progress toward their goals, and so it was my obligation to make a different, recommendation for what faith would look like. And then the parent obviously has due process rights around that, but it's their responsibility to make that offer based on what the child requires.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm assuming that childcare licensing would not be involved when the public schools take over the 3 to 5-year-olds.
If the program is in the public school building, then they do not need a childcare license. The only time they would need that is if a other entity, like there's several Head Start collaborations within public schools. So Head Start has a classroom. It's also serves as a 4-year-old classroom. If Head Start is running the classroom, they have to have a childcare center license. But if the public school is operating that classroom and it's for 3 to 5s, they do not need to, and they don't need to. Now, if it was just a 3-year-old classroom, just 3s, it may be different, and that would be an early learning team, Nicole Medora kind of question. I'm not sure where they landed on that. If it was solely for 3-year-olds, if they would need a license. I don't think they do, but I would want her to confirm that. I know if it's a combination 3 and 4, they don't.
Okay. Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Nothing else has been put in chat, but if anybody else wants to come off of mute, they're more than welcome to ask questions.
I have a question. At the cohort 2 meeting, they talked about us taking responsibility on the first day of school.
Right.
So relative to the questions of the individual from the special purpose private school, that's when our responsibility will take over?
The first day of school. Is
Okay.
that question? Yeah. The first day of school in September, if your school starts in September or August, whenever that is, that would be. And that's why it's so important to be looking for you to be invited to meetings all the school year so that you can be at the table to, to be able to make sure that you're going to be able to implement the IEP effectively and to ask questions about LRE and all those things that you would do.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question about when you've had the transition meeting from CDS to public school, and then let's say an evaluation is completed and that's reviewed in the middle of the summer. So you've already amended your IEP to start the first day of school, but then this evaluation comes after the fact. handle that because you've already got an amended IEP starting the first day.
Yeah, that's super tricky. So what we try to do, obviously, is if you're the special ed director or someone is the principal, somebody can be at the table to review that evaluation. That would be what we would want, because really it's your amendment. If it needs to be amended again, you would be the ones to do it, not us, because we will not be implementing the plan. So we try very, very hard to make sure a representative from the school could be at that meeting to review it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So Lori's information is in the slide deck. If you want to get in contact with her, if questions come up after this point, you can also reach out to any one of us. We can always pass along the message to Lori and get your contact information to her so that you guys can talk. So we're just going to kind of wrap things up. So this is our PD schedule. These are the office hours and trainings that we've done at the beginning of the 24-25 year. These links will take you to the YouTube video and slides, and we have some that are coming up to our website that will be available, just aren't there yet. And then we have some upcoming that go to the end of May. So please join us for any of these trainings that are coming up. And then this is our feedback and contact hour form. So please fill out the feedback. We really appreciate it. We use it as much as we can to adjust our PD within certain parameters. And so we do appreciate that feedback. Today's training is today's date, which is 3/12/25, and it's transition from CDS to public school. So if you select that training and enter your email, I will send you a contact hour for joining us today. And then this is our DOE. This is where you can find the Maine Department of Education on social media and online. And then this is our supervision, monitoring, and support team contact information. And like I said, we can always get you to Lori if you missed her email in the earlier slide. We can pass that along. So please reach out to us if you have any questions or want feedback around anything. We're always happy to provide that. So before we give you back a few minutes in your afternoon or evening, any last minute questions? Well, awesome. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. And thank you so much, Lori, for being here and
Welcome.
presenting all this information. It was very informative.
Great.
Yeah, and I am going to stay on just for a minute. Someone asked me to stay on. So have a great afternoon, everyone. And we'll see
Thank
you next
you.
time. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.